And we have a treat for you tonight. We have the radio greats. See how humble they are. And we are going to be covering a great topic of the radio days, of days gone by when we all enjoyed tuning into the radio. And those days are really gone by.
Well, hopefully you still do.
We do tune in the radio, but it's not the same.
When we're in our car.
Right. So we have Ray C. over here, way over on the left, and then Tom Connery and Frank Philippone, who used to own the radio station, and we have Dave Clark and Scott May and Dave Spence. So we're all going to get a treat from them on the AM radio frequency highway. But hope you enjoy the program, and I wanted to bring to your attention, next month we're not meeting here, but we are meeting. And we're not meeting on Friday. We're meeting on Saturday. And we're not meeting at night. We're meeting in the afternoon. So, Donna Coco is in charge of that program, and she's going to say a few words about what you can expect next month.
The program next month is going to be at the Forest Hill Mausoleum.
Oh.
We are going to do folklore, legends, and myths. Joy Contois and Tom Goodwin will be our storytellers. There is a reservation for this because seating is limited since it's in the mausoleum. You can call Dot for a $10 reservation. There'll be food, beverages, and a raffle. And the raffle will be a chef comes to your home to prepare a 3-course meal for you for 4 guests. And there'll be a bottle of wine that we had made for us, a private label. And that will also be auctioned off. 2 bottles of wine, 2 champagne glasses, or 2 wine glasses. But it is a $10 reservation, and it's going to be October 15th, which is a Saturday. There are flyers, and Dot will be our contact person if you wish to make reservations for that night.
Okay. And also keep it. Did you have one more thing to say?
Nope.
Keep in mind that that the seating is limited. So once the tickets are gone, there is no entry. So we have 50 tickets, and that's it. So if you call me and reserve your tickets, you don't have to pay until you come. But when you come, you'll pay at the door the $10 because your name is going to be on the list.
Right. And if your name is
But
not
if
on
you
the list,
just come without calling me, then you're going to pay $12.
yes, a little bit more.
Yeah. So,
And this also is in with the Cemetery Commission. We're doing this to raise funds for restoration at the cemetery. So it's a combination partnership here.
exactly. It's not just the Friday nights in Fitchburg History Club. The Cemetery Commission is combining their efforts with us. And I think the storytelling of some of the legends of the past are going to be quite interesting. We even are going to have a couple of butlers dressed in butler costumes. So it's going to be fun.
It should be a fun night.
Really,
I hope to see a lot of you there.
hope to see you all there.
Yes. So there are flyers. We wish to save the day.
All right, so on with the show.
Okay. Now you say something.
Yeah,
Dave.
exactly. I think, actually, it's interesting that Ray is down at that end and I'm down at this end because we started virtually at the same time, 1967. Ray at WEIM and me at WFGL. And so we're the bookends here. And I don't know, maybe we should, well, we've already been introduced, so I think, well, what's already been said is that what local radio was, the big word is was. It's just not what it used to be. And I missed that. And a story I told what really pointed it out when we were having the meeting discussing what we were going to do tonight. At one point, WFGL and I think it was WFMP, I forget what the call letters were because they were changing so much. But at this point, this would have been about 1983 or so, we were in that little broadcast house on Pritchard Street, and they had two separate staffs. They were separate announcing staff, separate sales staff. There was about 20 people bumping into each other in this little building. And you fast forward 6-7 years, my last full-time radio job was at WCAT in Athol, Orange. And I went in on a snow day, and I was doing morning news. And I got there about 5:45, and I left about 12:30 after the noontime news. I had contact with no other person that whole time, other than kids calling saying, "Is there any school today?" I was it. So that's how it changed, and sad.
A lot of reasons for the change, of course, are the changes in technology that we've all seen. As Dave referenced, when he and Ray started, we didn't really have FM radio. It was all AM on the dial. There weren't too many FM radio stations, and if there were, they were experimental. And of course, FM really put the pressure on AM radio because of the quality on FM frequencies that far outdid what you heard on AM radio. You didn't lose FM under a bridge or behind a building, and generally the signals were a lot stronger, so you could hear FM radio in a larger area. So AM radio started to get squeezed with the introduction, I think, of the FM band and the popularity and just the listenability of FM radio. So that's really when AM radio started to have its challenges. And in a small market like Fitchburg and Leominster, back in the day, there were several commercial radio stations, and it was as Frank reminded us, it was a rated market. They actually took audience ratings in the market to determine how many people were listening to each radio station and what the demographic listenership was. And that's when there was competition between WFGL, WEIM, and Leominster, WLMS. Gardner had a very viable radio station, WGAW, and even WCAT in Orange, their AM radio station, was certainly within the region. And they were all up and running and fully staffed, and that seemed to change probably pretty quickly in a decade of time in the 70s into the 80s. A lot of that started to change, and by the 90s, WEIM was it.
Tom goes back to the
Marconi.
50s. Marconi? Marconi were like that.
Me too. Well, actually, I can remember, and I'm sure that there must be somebody in the audience that can remember the day that WEIM went on the air. It was October 6, 1941. And I can remember being only 5 years old at the time that my mother was so eager to hear a radio station in Fitchburg that she put 1340 on the dial, and that was WEIM. And the man who put that station on the air was Ted Kalin. Ted Kalin spent his entire life working at WEIM. He was a wonderful man. He brought radio into Fitchburg, and it was kind of unusual to have a radio station in Fitchburg outside the Boston market. Over the years, AM stations really grew. I think at one time, Worcester had at least 5 or 6 AM stations. I can remember that when I was in high school. But WEIM was the pioneer in this area. Raymond?
Well, I don't know if I ought to begin with my earliest recollections. I can remember, my mother taking me to WEIM when they were on Main Street. We had a suite of offices in the Fitchburg Theater building. And it just come from the dentist, Dr. Nemi, who was in the same building. And so she walked me over there, and I have no idea why, but I was fascinated. And I can't remember the individual's name who was on the air, but he went on to management Frank, you might remember him because I cannot remember him, but you dealt with him at AAB in Worcester. And he was the general manager there in the 60s. I cannot remember his name, but I'd always been fascinated with it. And for me, it began as a hobby, something I've always wanted to do, and so I was manufacturing footwear in the 60s and got a chance to attend a local school because I had looked at schools, New England School of the Connecticut School of Broadcasting and places like that. But I was manufacturing footwear, and also I was doing public relations for Anwelt Corporation for a number of years. And the two sort of went together, and so I filed reports from Atlantic City when Anwelt went to the National Footwear Association shows in Atlantic City. We spent 2 or 3 days there, and I would file reports to WEIM from the floor of the convention hall. And that was my introduction to actually doing something. And I got to school. I was in the first night class at the New England School of Broadcasting, which was on Main Street, and I believe was begun by Ron Morgan and Ed Brogy. But I don't know what role George Chatfield had in it, if any.
I think he owned it.
Did he? So apparently he put up the money. There was a day class, and there was a night class, and while I was working, I borrowed the money and went and took the course. And in April of '67, I got my first gig at AM 1280, part-time, working weekends as a hobby. October of '71, I began full-time, 6 days a week, 2 to 7, Monday through Saturday. But my part-time work was Saturday and Sunday and fill-in at night. So I was flexible and eager to do it. I would have swept the floors for nothing as a 14-year-old. But so I did it for 3.5 years. October of '71, I went full-time, 6 days a week, 2 to 7. And then I became program director for about a year or so. And then started mornings from 6 to 9, 1973, June of '73, and worked that shift for 33.5 years, which is one reason why you need your 8 hours of sleep. And if you don't, you can have a series of heart attacks along the way, and you've got to get your rest and your sleep. But I did it for 33.5 years, semi-retired in '06, still there under different call letters, WPKZ. We're now an FM at 105.3. I do some limited work, mostly spots and public service programs that we download for Sunday slots. And I do the Smart Shopper on Saturday morning, 10 to noon.
I would like to suggest a round of applause for this incredible individual here.
Oh, yeah?
Who did such a wonderful job.
Over the years, we've had people come and go. Luke Conry is here. Luke and I worked together. He came in and joined me on Saturday mornings. We had a wonderful time together for a span of 3 or 4 or 5 years in the late '80s, early '90s, I think. And wonderful time. And I can remember people along the way, but even as a kid, always was fascinated with. And the thing about radio is you maintain some anonymity because people generally don't know what you look like. If you hang around long enough and you get out there and you do enough broadcasts, people begin to know who you are. But pity the poor person who has to work on television and be seen. So I've always enjoyed the anonymity that you can maintain while living a semi-normal life. So I did that, went through various phases at the station. We played music for a lot of years. Did some talk, and Dave Clark and I worked together through the '80s. We've had a lot of people come and go over the years that went on to very bigger and better things. Chicago, L.A., Boston, Hartford, they all came through. They all cut their eye teeth. And also, a great resource was Fort Devens. So we had the pleasure of a lot of talent that would come in, such as Jim Bohannon, who went on to replace Larry King in the Mutual Network. Jim Bohannon worked weekends while he was stationed at Fort Devens, and when he shipped to Vietnam, I replaced him in April of '67, doing part-time work. And other than that, I'll wait for questions. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Ray, I guess I have to tell you that I did a lot of work at WEIM as their news director. And back in those days, it was like competition with Sentinel and Enterprise. We wanted to see if we could get what we thought would be the Sentinel headline first. But it wasn't just what we used to call rip and read, rip stuff off the wire services and read it. Spent a lot of time with the Fitchburg Police Department and with the Fitchburg Fire Department. And, you know, I could tell you everybody's name on the fire department and on the police department. Not so today. And a lot of us, and I'm sure you're going to hear it from people, are going to have some very memorable moments, some of them a bit of comedy, some of them sad. You know, one of the most prolific things that I think I had to do on the radio was announce the death of President John F. Kennedy. And I'll never forget that day, and we spent a lot of time on the air doing that. Locally, I was there the night that Captain Jimmy Belleville died on the Fitchburg Fire Department. It was a tragic thing. We didn't have a two-way radio. We had to rely on the telephone. And as I walked down Fairmount Place, Jim Belleville and his two young children were walking toward me. And we exchanged greetings. I went on the telephone, and I reported that there was a serious fire in Cleghorn at the Belleville Furniture Company. And by the time I got back to the fire scene, Jim Belleville was gone. Very tragic thing. There were happy times, but again, there were a lot of sad times, too.
One of the things that I remember, because I worked for a number of years for this gentleman named Norman Knight. He was a chap that never finished high school and taught me a great deal. I have 2 or 3 degrees. Taught me a great deal about life, particularly business, and suggested that you really have to do something before you can say that you know anything. And Norman Knight founded with 4 or 5 other fellows an organization called the 100 Club. One of the first people that they dealt with was the gentleman you mentioned.
Jim Belleville.
And they provided for the support of the widow and the children if they could go on to college. I think one of 2 of them did, and they provided all of the funds for that. And this has become one of the largest, most successful, the 100 Club, organizations of its kind in the country. And one of the things that I also learned about broadcasting is that even though I wasn't as good an announcer as Ray C. or Dave Clark or Jack Raymond, doesn't happen to be here. How many people remember Jack Raymond? I'm sure you must. One of the things I learned was that they were pretty nice people, these announcers, characters. So when someone suggested that I forget my tenor voice and get into something else, like, say, sales, one person said, "You're too honest. You'll never be a salesman. You can't do that. You have to con people." And I said, "Oh, I can't do that." So I was given a list of 5 advertisers. One of them was Monturis. Another was Kidder Davis, a furniture store in downtown Fitchburg. And I went to see Kidder Davis, and I said, "My name is Frank Philippone, like telephone." And next thing you know, the man was screaming at me, top of his lungs, "What are you doing here? I don't ever want to see you again. I'll never advertise on WIM, no matter what," because of a person named Jim Fitzgerald. I'm sure you remember Jim Fitzgerald, hopefully. He would run into Mr. Davis or one of the people there and have a small conversation, and next thing you know, send him a bill for $500 or $600 for advertising. The person never ordered. So there were those kinds of things to deal with. And but mostly the idea I had was let the announcers do the announcing, let the disc jockeys be the disc jockeys, and I'll concentrate on sales and editorials because my employer insisted on doing lots of local stuff. So I can't remember a time we ever turned any public service announcement down. We had more public service on than we had commercials. We had, if you want to, we used to do live broadcasts. I'll never forget, we did one at the IC Credit Union one year for the Cancer Society and raised thousands and thousands of dollars. I'm not sure exactly how much, but I think it was something like $60,000. The next year, the Cancer Society came back to us and said, look, you did so well for us last year, we don't want you to do anything for us this year. And we were amazed at that. So we went to the Salvation Army. They said, okay, we'll tack on. We raised thousands of dollars for the Salvation Army. The following year, the Cancer Society came back and said, look, would you like to do work with us? We can't. We were with Salvation Army. And that's how that went. But the fact is, one of the things that we did is we sold advertising, from my perspective. We did remote broadcasts, which were not only public service, but also commercial broadcasts from all over the place, mostly Fitchburg, but also Leominster, and rarely in places like Gardner. But the fun of it was seeing our station grow and become what it became, which was significant. Not just WEIM. Please remember, George Chatfield owned WFGL. George Chatfield was responsible for I-90. That never would have existed if it wasn't for George Chatfield, who fought, and finally he wanted to make it a toll road, but they decided that they wouldn't do that, the state, and as a result we have it as a freeway. But the point is that he had some things, and he had some outstanding people at WFGL. Really, the people that I've got all kinds of names written down here, but I think I'll pass on that and let somebody else have a chance.
Well,
And
you mentioned George Chatfield, who, of course, Scott and I worked for. My favorite George Chatfield story, I don't know how many of you remember, he used to do these editorials on the weekend. And George was a little to the right of Attila the Hun. But he...
A little?
So usually it was Dick Ziegler that would sit in a little studio and record, usually on a Thursday, sometimes on a Friday, to record George's editorial, and then they'd play it back for him, and he'd go on his way, and it'd be played over the weekend. Well, this one particular day, I was the one that was designated. So George came in. It was right before Christmas time, and he did an editorial about why we should buy locally. It's Christmas season, support your local merchants, and he went on, naming merchants on Main Street, and support your local merchants. And he finished. And I said, you want to hear it back, George? He says, no, I'm late. He says, I got to pick up Marie, who was his wife, down at the train station. Really? He says, yeah, she went shopping in Boston. Thank you, George. But he was an amazing guy, and of course, had a great background in advertising in New York. And
Of course, George not only had WFGL, WFMP, which was considered a sleeping giant, which is now WXLO, 50,000 powerful watts that gets all over the state. He had the Montechusett Review, and he also had the Muzak franchise, all in one location there. And so he was very significant in the market.
do you remember Rinso White, Rinso Blue? George Chatfield created that. George Chatfield created Rinso White, Rinso Blue. It's a soap powder, I think, detergent, isn't it?
How many of you remember Frankly Speaking with Ed Broggie?
That's right. Outstanding program.
Well, if you're in the same building with George Chatfield and Ed Broggie, you've got as far right as you can go and as far left as you can go. And it was pretty interesting because Ed would have his show and express his opinions and occasionally hang up on a few people. And then George would write his editorial. And basically...
where George Chatfield came up here from? He was with the Lever Brothers in New York.
Yes.
Yeah, we were friends.
Rinso White, Rinso Blue, right?
So it was very interesting, particularly during the Nixon era, Watergate, the Vietnam War, when all of that was going on. Ed was pretty much at his prime with Frankly Speaking, and George was at his prime with his editorials. So it was very interesting. I started at WFGL while I was still in college. I go back to my senior year in high school at Oakmont Regional. Dave's family lived in Ashburnham. My family lived in Ashburnham. Our mothers were friends at Ashburnham Community Church. Dave's mother, Barbara, cleared it with Mr. Svens here for me to visit him at WFGL because I was interested in going into broadcasting. So my the first person I met in radio was Dave Svens, who later became my partner. We became very good friends over the years, but did a lot of high school football games together. We also did the morning show at WFGL for years.
We were number one, weren't we?
Competing with Ray C.
What were the years?
I actually, Ed Broglie was doing mornings when I started working there. And Ed decided he didn't want to continue the grind of mornings, I think. He went into sales and continued, frankly speaking. And it was the fall of 1971, I started doing mornings at WFGL. I did it for a year, and then I begged off of it because of the difficult hours. And I think maybe you jumped in at that time. I'm not
did
sure.
it for a while.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we got back together. I actually went from being a disc jockey at the radio station to a newscaster. And that's really where my career took that path right up until 1987 when I left radio. But I worked at WRKO in Boston for a period of time and WKOX in Framingham. And I was working in Framingham when the Challenger blew up. And Krista McAuliffe, her family lived in Framingham. We had gotten to know them over the course of several months prior to the Challenger lifting off. We had interviewed Krista McAuliffe, and we had a reporter live on the air. If you recall, the Challenger was delayed several days because of ice buildup and weather conditions, low temperatures. We had a reporter from the radio station in Florida during that time, and I was anchoring the morning news at WKOX. And we were going to go to that reporter when the flight finally took off, which we did. And she was on the air reporting when the Challenger blew up. Of course, her parents were there. And Tom kind of referred to it, he being a longtime newsman, but you put on a game face when something difficult happens because you know the job you have to do. You have to tell the folks what happened, and you have to gather the information. And we had a fairly large news team at WKOX, and we all just went about our work and continued live on the air throughout the day, reporting what had happened. So, as Tom said, some events, I remember interviewing Rosalind Carter at the Rendezvous restaurant when Jimmy Carter was running for president. She came through Fitchburg, and they set up interviews with the news media at the Rendezvous. She was a little peanut of a person. Speaking of peanuts.
Yeah. Rosalind Carter, when Bo Blackwell was mayor, and I was doing news at the time at WFGL, and he called me. He was mayor, and he says, Dave, he says, I need a favor. He says, Rosalind Carter is in town, and could you enter it? And I said, who? Because nobody, he said, yeah, Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter's wife. I said, oh, he hasn't got a chance in hell. I did it, but yeah.
But you knew Billy Carter, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Billy Beer.
Dave talks about interviewing people, and I was telling them the story when we were having our planning meeting. One afternoon, the sales staff at WFGL said to me, Tom, we want you to go down to Lake Whalum, to one of Guy Palmerton's, who ran the Whalum Playhouse, in one of his cottages, because Ginger Rogers is down there. Yeah. And we want you to interview Ginger Rogers. So naturally, I jumped at the chance, and I took this tape recorder. And back in those days, and I think some of these guys will say it, the equipment was not the greatest, to say the least. So it was a reel-to-reel tape, and it was a portable. So I went down there, and I set it all up, and I started the record button, and I interviewed Ginger Rogers. And I got back to the station, and the manager said, how'd you make out? I said, fine. She was a very pleasant woman. He said, well, let's hear the tape. And I went upstairs. There wasn't a damn thing on the tape. Nothing.
Gone forever.
Dave Clark was our sports director for a number of years. He also was a sports person before that, working under Joe White. Joe White was an interesting personality.
Well, I really didn't work under Joe White.
Well, in a way you did. Obviously you didn't. That's right. I expressed that poorly. But I have to tell you one quick story about Joe White, and that will lead into David. I suggested to Joe White, that perhaps he could do a comment on sports, some comment of an editorial nature, perhaps some pitcher that didn't do so well, something like that. So he said, "Okay, I'll do that, Frank. An editorial comment about something in sports, right? Okay." The first time he did it, he did a comment on Billy Graham. And he was vicious.
Wow.
Calling him, I can't tell you. So I called him in the next day and said, "What are you doing? You talked about one of the nicest people that ever was, Billy Graham, and what does that have to do with sports?" He said, "Well, I got this feeling about these guys that, look, I don't want to hear any more. Now stop." "Okay, if that's the attitude, I quit." So he walked out of my office, and I was trying to call him back, and my sales manager at the time, Mike Bettel, comes running into me and says, "Let him go, let him go." And so that's how it happened. I was going to call the next Saturday morning, Friday, interestingly, and suggest that, but as it turned out, I didn't, because I had pressure from my people inside the station, and I always try to listen to them. So David was there, and we had a chat. And I said, "David, congratulations, you're the new sports director." That's just how it happened. David took that program and turned it into one of the finest sports programs ever. Talk show, and now with that, I turn it to David Clark, who not only is a fine sportscaster, but an outstanding human being as well.
Thank you, Frank.
And a wonderful city councilor as well.
Thank you. Anybody else?
AV department here in Fitchburg.
He mentions Joe White. Joe White was a character. I mean, he was a riot. Some of the things that he pulled off. I remember there was, and I'll never forget it. He came in to do. He would go on the air. Chuck Morgan would go on at 3:00, and ABC News, and Joe would go on about 3:06, whatever. And it's 3:04, and there's no Joe White. And 3:05, and Joe comes. Joe flying up into the studio. You know, he had to run up those stairs. So he's huffing, puffing, and here's sports with Joe White. Joe goes, and he says, "I went to a movie today with my daughter." He says the name of the movie was Dark Crystal, and he went on to talk about the movie. And at the end, he said, "Pretty good movie, Dark Crystal, and that's sports." I want to find out what the score was. He's telling me about some movie that he could give him, rats behind it out.
You mentioned movies at FGL. I don't know how many remember Dick O'Leary, who was the manager of the Sax Cinemas.
Sure.
First, the Fitchburg Sax Center on Main Street, and then Sax Cinemas down at Searstown. Used to do a weekly show on FGL with Ron Morgan. And he'd come in on, I don't know, Thursday, whatever, and talk about the movies that were coming up this week. And I was living right across the street from the station on Pritchard Street. And I was taking a nap, and I woke up, and I turned the radio on just in time for it. So Ron says, "Well, Dick," first of all, Dick was this big man. He was a bowl full of jelly. Well, anyway, what's new with the movies this week? And he said, "Well, we have two movies." He said, one is called Hotel. It's about the goings-on in a big city hotel. And the other movie is Not With My Wife, You Don't. And there was this pause, and it was dead silent, and you could just hear this. And it was live, and so I went running across the street, and unfortunately it wasn't recorded. But it was a cool movie story.
Those stories that Dave tells about some of the humorous things that went on in the radio station, a lot of times, somebody would do something to break you up. Okay, and it was pretty continuous when I was at FGL. And I can remember one time I was living at home, and I went home, and my mother said to me, "We were listening to the radio today, and you, my son, are going to get fired fired if you don't stop laughing. Well, here, let me give you this picture. It's 6:30 in the morning. You're doing the newscast, and Ed Brogy takes his pants off and runs through the studio where you're doing the news in a pair of polka dot underwear. I mean, this went on constantly. People trying to break you up. You've all probably heard the story of a newsman reading his copy, and the guy that's running the board, or the controls, as we call him, the board, would come in with a cigarette lighter, and you'd be holding your copy like this, and he'd light the bottom of the copy. I mean, these things went on all the time at the radio station, and sometimes you couldn't tell some of the stories of things that were going on.
Well, how many remember Dick Ziegler's Songs of Faith? And he did Sunday with the Pops.
Yeah.
And he was a wonderful man. He just passed away a few months ago.
About 3 months ago.
Well, Ziggy, I worked with him in the afternoon. He played the music, I did the news. And as Tom described, we had a news booth with a window, soundproof window, and the main studio was on the other side of the window. So I would be looking at Dick Ziegler. He would hand off the news to me, and as soon as I started to read, if there was one stumble, it was soundproof to a degree, but I could hear the screaming and the yelling, and his greatest challenge every day was to try and crack up whoever was doing the news. And Dave and I had a routine where we would put the blinders on. Now, you had headphones on, you're speaking into your microphone, and of course, other sound, like Dick Ziegler yelling at you or laughing, you could hear it coming through your headphones. So we would take the headphones off, still trying to read the news, put our thumbs like this and our hands like this, and just bend over the news so we couldn't see his antics or hear what he was doing, because he was relentless trying to break you up.
I think when you try to, we all had fun. I mean, EIM was a fun place to work. We always had fun there, and we had a great staff, and some things Frank will never know about.
Let's keep it that way.
Yeah, and we all.
Statute of limitations.
You don't want to get fired.
But at the end, it was all about the final product, and it was serving the public, which was a big deal. That we wanted to give the public the correct information. I can remember one night where I had a guest come in, and I won't mention his name.
Oh, come on.
Fred Sullivan. Freddie came in and he said, boy, you're going to have a busy show tonight. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, two folks that a lot of people may know of passed away tonight. And I said, well, who are they? And he said, Ted Damko, who was the Leominster Athletic Director, and Jim Taddeo, who was involved with St. Bernard's and amongst other schools. And I said, well, that's, thank you for giving me that information. And we went on the air at 6 o'clock, and I didn't say anything about it. And time went on, and you could see Freddie, and if you know Freddie, his face gets redder and redder and redder. And finally, during a commercial, he says, didn't you hear what I said? I mean, we had two people pass away, and I says, Fred, I got to check it out. I says, I just can't, nothing against you, but I can't go on the air, without checking my sources. So Howard Cosell went on at, people remember Howard Cosell.
He worked there.
He went on for 3.5 minutes. So I went on the phones. I called my neighbor who works in Leominster Hospital before HEPA, before all that stuff came in. And I said, do you know if Ted Damko passed away? And she said, yes, he did. I said, okay. And how about Jim Taddeo? Has he passed away? And she said, I don't know. So then I called Dave Spence, who was a friend of Jim Taddeo's. And I said, Dave, did Jimmy pass away? And he said, not that I know of. And so he called, and then he called me back, and he said, we were still off the air at this time, and he says, no, Taddio's okay. We had another phone call come in, and I said, "Yep, Fred's here. Yep, hold on." I gave the telephone to Fred, and he was no longer turning red. He was kind of shy and quiet, which is unlike Fred. And I said, "Well, Freddie, who was that?" And he said, "That was Jim Taddeo." He said, "Thank God you did not put that on the air." And it was just checking out your facts to be sure of what you were saying, because people were listening, and it was before ESPN, and it was before all that stuff. I can remember Todd Becker dying. It came over the wire at that time, and like I said, before ESPN. But Todd Becker was a really good football player at Fitchburg High School, and he got a full scholarship to Pittsburgh, and played with Dan Marino, and was part of that group that was a top 10 football team. And he was this guy from Fitchburg, and he played all the time. He was a bull. He died tragically in an accident, and I saw it come over the wire. And I knew that when I read it, there would be a lot of people who were hearing it for the first time. So you had to be kind of careful in what you said, and that it came over the wire was proof enough that he had passed. But I remember that breaking the news about 10:30 in the morning, and I'm sure a lot of people didn't know about it. And then it just kind of spread because the Sentinel had been out for the day, and I remember. But it's important, and I thank Frank for letting everybody know how important that was. That it was we were a public service. That was number one. We were a public service. We told the folks what was going on, and I really thank Frank and his family for giving me the opportunity. He always gave me a lot of confidence in anything that I did, and that continues on today. So.
I'd like to pick up on that, if I may. Frank and I worked together 33 years. He arrived in 65, Frank?
66.
66 as a salesman, and then became a sales manager, general manager, and then the owner. And in all the years, with 33, I can't recall one time where we got an objection to what we were doing, especially in morning drive, which is our prime time, 6 to 9. Frank never objected to the music, never objected to the guests. I can remember recording an editorial 30 years ago this year when Ted died. Frank had to come up and deliver sort of like a eulogy or an editorial. It was one of the most difficult things we had to do. We did it with one take, I can remember it. Yeah. But also over the years, we had no less than 30 local agencies on the air, free of charge, produced at our studios. We, and I took it upon myself, and Frank supported us all the way. We have national public service that comes in all the time, and especially if you're affiliated with a network, ABC and all of that. So my focus was getting these people in and recording them. And so we would do that. They'd come in, and there was a time when we had 30 of them on rotation, so we gave away more time than we ever sold. And we've got the likes of people who were shakers and movers in the community, Paul Scaparone, Jerry Krieger, people like that. My only regret is that we didn't save the outtakes because they were hysterical. Louis Isabel Funeral used to come in and do spots for IC Federal Credit Union. He was chairman of the board. And he loved to come on and do spots, and he'd come in, we'd do a session. And it was 20-take Louis, because he never got it the first time. Second time, third time, we go through it. This was part of the process, and they knew it. Jerry Krieger, the same way. Jerry would come in he'd do 2 30-second spots for the camera shop of Fitchburg. And he'd write them. And he'd do them always, without fail, first takes. Yep. And then he'd be out of there. And I thought, gee, well, he does write them, and he's probably writing it just, so he knows what's coming out. So one day, he blew the last line and never recovered. He couldn't, the more he did, the madder he got. And then it dawned on me after why he always did it one time and never did it again. But that one time, and there are anecdotes and stories like that all the way, great memories. I can remember having coffee at Friendly's across the street with Mike Nesmith. I can remember Charlie Daniels popping in, looking like Haystack Calhoun 40 years ago. This is before he broke out. And there were a few, Harry Chapin. I can remember playing Harry Chapin every day, 6 days a week following Paul Harvey. Frank never batted an eyelash. I mean, 4 or 5 minutes, 6 minutes, nobody was playing that stuff, but we were so taken by it. And he also attended a night group station, Clambake, at HEB. We had a station in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We had a station in Manchester, Claremont, New Hampshire, Worcester, and Fall River, and Fitchburg. So we had the ring around Boston. So if you bought a night buy, you bought the whole night chain, as opposed to buying a Boston market. And so Harry, we reached out to Harry. It was 1973. He had just recorded short stories. And he came to the studio, and we did a 3-hour special on Harry Chapin. We talked with him for a half hour or so, but he did. He went to the barbecue. And then, so there are people like that coming in. When you were playing music, you were subscribed to a major sheet. It was called the Gavin Report. And being a small market, you weren't as significant as being on a major market. And so the labels would go to the major markets. But they would work the regional markets first. And if you were a reporter for a major sheet like the Gavin Report, and you told Gavin what you were playing or what your pick was, it was important to the label because people across the country saw it and they would go play it and check it and they would add it, and so it was significant. They would come out. Buck Reingold came out from Kama Sutra Records back in the late 60s from New York. He'd open his trunk, and a lot of them all had their product in the trunks, all the albums, all the 45s, and they'd come up and they'd say, they got a new one from Brewer and Shipley, and they'd spin a little thing and they'd ask you to play it, and you'd hem and haw about the thing. But it was a great time, and it's a time when we had a high labor content. EIM, we broadcast 20 hours a day. We had 3-hour air shifts, and they were all local origination, all from the studio, all with announcers. We had a support staff, we had a sales staff, and we have about 25 people in that building, and today there are like 6. And so the technology has changed along the way. But all through those years, we never lost sight of the fact that we need to be responsible broadcasters. And there was a time when you had to keep files. And every 3 years you had to go out in the community and to take a survey and to find out what the issues were, what people were concerned about. And you kept that FCC file in the station, and once in a while an inspector would come in or things like that. That's all gone. All the regulations dealing with community service, or your responsibility, you're licensed to Fitchburg. WXLO is licensed to Fitchburg, although they don't like to say so. And legally they have to give a station ID, but they like to slip it in so people don't know where they really are. And we got that with CGY and Haverhill and places like that. So they want to regionalize, and that's one way of doing it. But our focus was local. It was Fitchburg, Leominster, Gardner. There was a period of time when we simulcasted in Gardner. So they heard us on 1340 when Gardner went dark. They went dark for a couple of years, and Frank made arrangements to get us on GAW signal. So we carried on that way. But there were a lot of changes over the years, and it was just...
Ray, you mentioned Ted Kalin, who was a great guy. I can't believe it was 30 years ago.
30 years ago, 81.
He passed away. He was a great guy. He put WEIM on the air.
Yep.
And the engineers were an interesting crew. And we have Norm Rivers in the audience here.
Yeah.
Norm goes back a long way.
He's got a list, too.
Engineering,
We
absolutely.
got to get to Norman's list. Yeah.
My favorite engineer story, we were doing a football Saturday when they played football on Saturday afternoons. We were doing a game at Crocker Field. I'm not sure if I was doing it with Tom or with Scott, but we were about ready to do the game. The band came out, played the national anthem.
Cheerleaders?
Cheerleaders, yes. Yeah, they were cheerleaders, yes. And then the station, and we were listening off the air, so we were listening to the actual signal, and the band finishes playing the national anthem, and we're off. So I guess we had to go to the big press box to call There was a phone. What you have to know is at that time there were engineers at the transmitter site. They had to be there. So we called up there and no answer. So we called Don Coleman, who was our chief engineer at WFGL, who lived in Ashby. I said, Don, we're off the air. The engineer up at the transmitter at that time his name was Paul. And Paul used to tell this story in AA meetings, so I can. So we tried to, Don tried to. So Don drove from Ashby up to the transmitter site, which is on Alpine Road in Fitchburg. Nobody there. So Don put the transmitter on, and we finally got on the air sometime after the kickoff. Well, what had happened was Paul was taking a nap and woke up just as the national anthem, the band, was finishing. And he thought, because they used to play the national anthem when they signed off the station at night. So he heard the end of the national anthem, turned off the transmitter, got in his car, and went home, not realizing it's broad daylight. So yeah,
I'm glad you brought that up. The thing about the engineers is we had engineers, full-time engineers. They do 10-hour air shifts. You were on the air from 6 to 6, 6 to midnight, 6 a.m. to midnight, and then we had 3 or 4 engineers on the staff because you had part-time, you had weekends, and in the wintertime, they were, a lot of times during storms, they couldn't get off the hill, off Alpine Hill. We didn't have ski-mobiles at the time or things like that, but they had a little kitchenette up there, and they could stay up there for a couple of days if they had to, keeping us on the air. So
When I was in school at Boston University, I was a freshman, and they put me on the board, and all I was doing is riding the board. I was not announcing at all. And all of a sudden, we're off the air. So I got up and ran around the corner to Jim Bonney, God rest his soul, who was an engineer, chief engineer. He built the BCN, Boston Concert Network, originally, it was called. Became a top 40 station or whatever. But in any event, he said, slow down, what's the matter, son? Take it easy. What's the problem? So we're off the air? I said, well, that's all right. No one knows we are off the air. Don't worry about it. Went over to this 5,000-watt transmitter, gave it a kick. Bingo, we came back on the air. He knew exactly what was wrong with it. He'll fix it one day. But there was no hurry back in those days. And so I walked back to my studio and sat down and said, they're amazing, these people, these engineers. It's beyond my understanding. And that's how it was. We were fortunate to have Ted Kalin, God rest his soul, because he was that way. He was just incredible.
I'd like to mention a name that hasn't been talked about too much tonight is Jim Chalmers. A lot of people remember Jim Chalmers. He did Speaking for Sports on WEIM for many years, and he did it for Kimball and Son Clothiers. Their slogan was Clothiers for Lad and Dad. And Jim did quite a bit of sports. I think I did my first football game with Jim. And then he came over to WFGL. And I used to do the 6 o'clock news in the evening. I had a split shift. That was really fun, 5 in the morning till noontime, and then back at 4 and worked at 6:30. So Jim brought some great guys into the station. I had an opportunity to meet Johnny Most, and Jim had a little twang in his voice, and he used to say, Tommy Connery, I'd like you to meet Tommy Heinsohn. I met Tommy Heinsohn. Well, anyway, one day I was walking down by the old post office with Jim Chalmers, and I'm sure older people are going to remember Heikki Porinen. He did the Finnish program on WEIM, and I'm walking down the street, and Jim says, hi, Heikki, how are you? And Heikki exchanged greetings to him. And, of course, Heikki had a Finnish accent. He says, did you ever meet Tom Connery? And Heikki says, no. I says, well, nice to meet you. And he looked at me and he says, Jesus, I thought you was a big fella.
That was him, too. Yeah. Absolutely.
We had an opportunity to meet a lot of people. I can remember back in the 50s, some of you remember the singer Jerry Vale? Jerry Vale came to Fitchburg because he was going to be on Tal Hood's program on WFGM. And he was coming up Main Street in a convertible, and they had the radio on, and Tal Hood was playing one of Jerry Vale's songs. And they turned that radio way up, and Jerry was mouthing the song as he was coming up Main Street. Now you say something, Dave. Dave, you can tell that story.
Yeah.
One of the things, perhaps, David, for just a second, to keep in mind is that it was a different time. And I'm not talking about the internet or the development of something I despise, which was having equipment, machines do everything, and people nothing. Automation, I thought, was my enemy. And the point is that one of the reasons that we have a situation now, not just here, because we were fortunate for those years to have what we had, but throughout the country, there is no place where a person can learn to be an announcer. There's no small market that you can go to and practice your trade and then move on to, like so many that have been in Fitchburg from FGL. We could mention many, many people that went to work in Boston and other places. And that's the saddest part of all. And of all the things, and I'm sure you have lots of questions to ask us, and perhaps we'll get to that at some point soon, and we'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
Eric.
Actually, I have about 13 thoughts that have come to my mind since you guys have started.
That's more than we've had.
You know, it's funny. This is the first time I've attended one of these things. I've seen it in the paper all the time, and I finally get down here. And, what an interesting evening it is. And one of my first observations was that, all this beautiful reminiscing about radio. I've always loved radio. It kind of struck me there aren't a lot of people here, probably under 50, at this gathering today. You had mentioned that, frankly speaking. I remember Express Your Opinion was on EIM, wasn't it, Tom?
Yes.
And who did Express Your Opinion?
Jerry Olin did it at
There
some
was a
time.
gentleman named Barry first started it. I can't recall what his first name was.
Then I was thinking about the Yankee Trader. I remember that show.
Yeah, I remember.
And what else down here? Well, I want to say to you, Scott, because geez, I knew that Jason Duda was not going to be here. I talked to Jason quite often in the morning. And do I enjoy him? And you can tell him I said so.
I will do that.
Okay, Yankee Trader, that was that.
We made sure not to invite him, but that's okay.
Who was the guy on WFGL? And he did a country western music.
Gene
Gene
Laverne.
Laverne, yeah. That's right, kind of good stuff, yeah. And I was one thing over here. Then, and who was the lady? In fact, Gracie, you told me about her. She is now with NPR, but she was with EIM at one point.
Lisa Mullins.
Lisa Mullins. Yeah, Lisa Mullins, yeah.
Ann Murphy was another.
Really?
Lisa Judy working at a FM station, a public broadcast.
Yes, at GBH.
Okay. And I just have two other quick things to ask. So my wife was waiting for me to bring her dancing up in Winchton races. So I can remember back in the 50s, my mother and I and my sister having breakfast in the morning, getting ready for school. And Daddy would always listen to the radio. And on our kitchen table, we had two small transistor radios. And Daddy had one set up for EIM and one for FGL. And we would have our breakfast, get ready to go to Academy or to a Richardson Road School. And we kind of wanted to be talking. If the news came on, we couldn't talk. And then as soon as EIM was over, he put the other radio on the other one. And I just remember being frustrated that, geez, how come we sit here, how we talk, listen to the news? And as I've grown older, I really enjoy the news myself. But just my memories of radio from years gone by, how much I've enjoyed it. And it was my father, one's over and the other one on. That was that. And my last comment is, one time I was asking Willie Nelson about a guy named Duncan Lamb. And you didn't remember him. And Duncan Lamb, he was the son of the doctor, as I recall.
Yep.
And so, and I can recall his being on the radio, probably, I'm guessing, late 50s, early 60s?
60s.
Yeah. So tell me about him.
I knew him because we were sort of neighbors. I grew up on Bond Street, and they lived on Prospect Street. And all I remember was they had a boxer, the dog, and I was scared to death of that dog. And the dog knew it and would just chase me. Duncan, he was on just for a very brief period on WEIM.
And when he was trained, I knew he did come across easily, as I recall.
Yeah, he did. And I don't know where he went, but yeah, I remember Duncan.
I have a question for Frank, and then I have other comments. I'm Larry Sidney. I grew up in Fitchburg, and when I was in, I think, the freshman year of high school, and it was during the war, and there was a group called Jive Junction, and we met in the Guild Hall at Christ Church, and I used to play the records for the dancers, and we had bands, but one of our advisors was a fellow named Dick Tucker, and that was back in the 40s, and then he went to Boston. And wasn't there Dave Rodman at one time?
Yes, both of them, yes.
Boston. And
Had great careers, both of
the
those.
program was Paul Anslin.
Paul Hanson.
And interesting, my son is an international lawyer and goes back and forth from New York to Finland. And he coming back one time, he met Paul. And Paul had a travel agency in New York City. And from then on, he traveled with that agency. And Paul passed away a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Didn't John O'Day sell...
WFGL.
John O'Day was the general,
Another outstanding guy.
ended up as general manager of WFGL.
But I have and I remember Ted Kalin as the engineer being stuck up on the hill.
Yeah.
But I have a question for Frank. I remember years ago when we first moved to the large store at 344 Main Street, the Student Brothers shoe store. There was a gentleman in talking to my father. They had met at the Y, well dressed, and I believe he was from Puerto Rico, and he is the first one that owned the station, I think, before Mr. Knight.
Muzzy Molina.
Muzzy Molina.
Is that who it was? I can picture him, and that's all I remember. That was in
The only recollection I have is that he was not a nice guy. Not a nice guy. But how true that is, I don't know. But I met a fellow named Siegel. There used to be... No, that's
Bugsy?
later. Another
Bugsy
Siegel.
Siegel?
No. Mr. Siegel used to be a partner with Norman Knight. I got a call one day that he was in the neighborhood and he would like to come and see the radio station. I said, come right ahead. So when he came, he said, I'm amazed that you let me do this because I don't think Mr. Knight would be very happy about this if he knew that you let me in because they had a falling out. And so we had a long, long conversation about things in general, and I said, that's not the way Mr. Knight is, never has been. And but we did some interesting things, and I well remember the student shoe stores, and I miss them greatly. But what do we have? What can we do to get it back? Is there anything we can do?
Main Street. It's a different world. But one other thing, I have a picture here of Paul McNally, who was
Sure. I remember
And
Paul.
in the write-up, it says, is also one of the youngest junior radio announcers in the country. And here's his picture from my yearbook, if anybody wants to see it.
The thing that was amazing about Paul was, he probably weighed about 115 pounds.
Yeah.
He was very,
Big voice.
but he had a voice of God. It was just this deep voice.
He was a cheerleader in 1946, the year I graduated. Speaking of Chalmers, Jim Chalmers' father was the retiring principal of the school, Fitchburg High, the year I graduated. And his brother was Don Chalmers, who was a flyer and a flight instructor. And he was one of the instructors for the Navy cadets that were at Fitchburg State College at the time. And they used to fly out of Fitchburg Airport and down to Dickinson's landing strip, and a fellow by the name of Bancroft Hall, and they were all involved with Air Scouts. We had an Air Scout squadron here. We wore powder blue uniforms, and I remember, quite a few of the fellows from there.
Powder blue. Yeah.
One of the people that I encountered commented about the Finnish program that was on every Sunday morning and how much he enjoyed it. He was not Finnish. It was entirely in Finnish. He didn't understand a word. He just liked the sound that the man made. That's a true story.
This is just a comment. I don't think it's that old, but there was this program, I don't know what station did it, I don't remember, but it's The Men from Maine. And whenever I would hear it, the background music and everything, I could just envision what old-time radio was like, and they'd do the comedy routine.
Yeah, it's Lord and Wally that do it.
I love it.
They started at WVBF in Framingham. WKOX was their AM station, and I worked with them when they first started out, which is, I think, almost 30 years they've been together. And it's the same frequency on the dial, 105.7, but now the call letters are WROR. But they still do with the Men from Maine. Yeah. A quick story about Jim Taddeo. We were talking about him a little earlier. It became a dear friend of Dave's and mine. Passed away a few years ago. He was the head football coach at St. Bernard's, and this is how we got to know him, doing the St. Bernard's football games, as we did, several different teams throughout the course of a season. And then Jim continued teaching at St. Bernard's, but retired from coaching, and he decided he wanted to tag along with Dave and I to go and help us with the broadcast. No charge. He did it for free. He just came along as a companion.
So did we, as our
Yeah, we didn't get paid a whole hell of a lot. He had great knowledge of football, so he was a great addition. And we were, back then, Fitchburg and Leominster used to play Manchester, New Hampshire, and Nashua. So we were traveling to one of those locations. It might have been that famous Nashua trip where we got lost and everyone followed us. But
You didn't have a GPS?
Taddeo was with us, and we were on our way up, and we were joking around about something, and all of a sudden he reaches into his pants and he pulls out a gun, and it was Big Bertha. So he was always packing Big Bertha with him. So we were well taken care of with Jim Taddeo.
Now, somebody
Did he
mentioned...
shoot at you?
No, he never
didn't.
did.
I thought he had.
Yeah.
No.
Somebody mentioned Gene Laverne, and Gene was just an amazing guy, of course, the country music king in the area. And a lot of people had an impression of Gene being this hayseed guy. I mean, that's the persona that he projected on the air. But the guy was smart, and I remember the cottage lunch on Main Street next to City Hall. Well, he was working nights, and he'd have supper there almost every night, a couple of beers. But he'd be sitting there reading the Wall Street Journal, and I'd sit there and talk to him. And he put like 3 kids through college by playing the stock market. I mean, he was a sharp guy, but everybody thought he was this yokel. And he was far from it.
He just liked country western music,
Yeah.
that's all.
Yeah.
But he was working Sunday nights at the Sleeping Giant, which was WFMP,
Yeah.
which was FGL's
That's right.
FM.
Yeah.
And they were hearing him in Maine. He did Sunday nights, and so it carried well and became a real fixture. And just about 2 or 3 months before he died, I had him booked for my program. And he said, if it rains, because he lived in Nashua, he said, if it rains, he says, I don't know if I can make the trip, And I don't know if we did have inclement weather, but he didn't show. And when I made the call, he had already died. And so I would have had, like we did with the Sundowners and Bob Bell. It was around 1980 we started opening up the program and inviting guests to come in from the community, mostly nonprofit organizations and agencies. But if you had a fundraising event coming up, we would open up an hour of morning drive, which was the most expensive time we had, from 7 to 8. And you never batted an eyelash. You never said, no, it's too valuable and blah, blah, blah. And from then on, and this is 30 years ago, we would have a co-host or someone come in, and we've been doing it ever since I retired in 06. So we were like 26 years ahead of...
Reminds me of a story where
and we weren't necessarily a talk show. We were playing music and other things, but we had people coming in, and before you knew it, you do 10, 15, 20 years of this, and you've got the shakers and movers coming in all the time. It was great fun.
I think if you listen to everybody at this table tonight, some of us are out of radio, some of us are still in it, some of us are doing it part-time, but it never leaves you. It never leaves you. I graduated from radio, television, and theater school in 1958, and it's still my first love. It still is. In fact, Ray and I have a date on Monday afternoon that I'm going to do some political spots for him. I love to do it, and I think these guys, they're sitting at this table, wouldn't be doing it unless they really loved it. We love the interaction with people. We love to hear what people got to say. Everybody don't like our style. So what? There's a button there. You can turn it off. Okay?
People did.
But you know, I don't think, speaking for myself and not for anybody at this table, I think it never, ever leaves you. If somebody offered me a part-time job tomorrow on radio, I'd probably say, yeah, I'll take it, because I just loved it.
I think a good example of radio and community radio is recently the December ice storm, where WPKZ, I don't know if it was EIM then or not, whatever we were. We were the only resource available to most folks without power who still had battery-operated radios, and there's what your radio station does for you. And that's the dedication that the people that work there have for the job, in some cases risking our lives, really, literally, to come in that storm, to put that radio station back on the air.
And during that storm, we lost the power in our building, our studios on Water Street. So we called Chief Roy. I don't know how we worked that out, but the building had no power. The transmitter, I think the transmitter was on auxiliary. We had a generator. So we had no power at Alpine Hill.
Right.
But there was a generator outside our door. You had to go down this long hallway outside, and parked in front was this huge generator providing us with the power strictly for the studio. The building was still without power, and that kept us on the air all that time.
Through that weekend, and Ben Parker, who was our station manager at the time, really went above and beyond the call of duty. And then Ray came in that weekend. Ann, Frank's daughter, Ann Bisbee, who was our station operations manager, came in that weekend. I was there on that Friday when we had nothing, and decided to turn around and leave.
And there were times in the morning, too, if you had a major storm, we could call the police department, and they'd shuttle one of us in at 5 in the morning, because we'd have to shovel out, or we just couldn't get in there. And they would do that. It didn't happen often, but when it did, they were right there, so they were very cooperative.
I get asked a lot, do you miss radio? And my stock answer is, I miss what it was. I don't miss what it is now. It's all automated and satellite stuff and right-wing talk shows and left-wing talk shows. But it was. You really did feel like you were part of the community. And I remember remote broadcasts. I mean, it was a big deal. A store was either opening or they're having a celebration, and the radio station would go down and do a remote broadcast, and that was a big deal. I mean, people would show up just to see what this radio guy looked like, and now
very disappointing now.
Yeah, the old line. You have a face for radio. Yeah.
The interesting thing about what he said, how true it is, was that Gene Laverne was working for FGL, and they wanted Gene Laverne, this particular place, this store, unimportant who it was, to do a thing, and he did. He was doing it. And they also wanted us to be down there, and Ray did that broadcast. So Gene was on one end of the store, broadcasting from this place, and Ray was on the other end of the store. I arrived, said to Ray, you know what? Both stations have the same broadcast. Right.
And I talked to him.
Right.
On the air.
That's right. They talked to each other on the air, discussed it. I went over to see Gene, shook his hand. He said, Frank, how are you? I said, fine. This was off the air. Yeah. Then he went back on doing his thing. And he said, the manager of WEIM, Frank Philippone, is here. And that's what it was about. It was something that should be treasured and remembered. And it's wonderful that this is going on today, because it's something to remember. The saddest part of it is that the young people will not know what they're missing, because they didn't. They're into the internet. They're into the video games and all the rest of it. I know, because I have two grandchildren, a 17-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old grandson, brilliant people, and they don't listen to radio. They have a little machine that they listen to it as, I forget what it's called. iPod. Thank you.
I'd like to add to the comments about, I was on Main Street for 40 years with shoes, and then with Clarence and all the merchants were friends. You know,
Exactly.
we were competitors, but we were all friends. There were 27 of us selling shoes, if you included Woolworths and Grants and department stores like Lincoln's, and Rogers had a shoe department. Goodwin, Bill Goodwin was my best friend, and we graduated high school together, and we were neighbors. And that's how it was in downtown Fitchburg in those days. But no comment about now. I've been at Leominster 55 years.
Some people will still remember, though. I used to, one night I had my 3 daughters with me, and the tape was rolling, and I had them say a little something, you know. Now, Sports Live with my daddy, or something like that, when they were little kids. And Dr. Mara, who was president of the college, would stop me once in a while and says, "Heard your show last night." I said, "Yes, thanks, Dr. Mara. I appreciate that." He says, "You weren't that good, but your kids were great." But, you know, Pee-wee is, and I get asked today, you know, boy, I miss the show, and I miss your kids, and, you know, I tell them now that, you know, Pee-wee's getting married in July, and my little one is 20, and so, I mean, things people still do remember, and I have the tapes to prove it, I guess. I also got some tapes of Ray C. singing. Ray is the worst singer in the world. He could not carry a tune in a wheelbarrow. That's not true. He played. No, there's this song that's called "Africa" by Toto. Oh yeah. And Ray had his, you know, he's got his headset on, and Ray likes to doodle a lot in the morning. He draws little stars and all this other kind of stuff there, right? And, you know, so he's in his own little world there, and the music is playing, and so he starts belting us out, and I grabbed a tape recorder, you know, went down on my hands and knees in the studio, and, you know, and I have it. But
There's a little note in the memorabilia table there addressed to Fuzzface, and it's not signed, but I'm thinking it was from David. So he used to call me things like
we had some
write me
good
little
names.
notes.
Fathead was
Spent a
always
lot of
the
good years
note.
together. David joined us right out of school, I think, right out of college.
1981,
Just
right
a
out
kid.
of school. Yeah, and I remember in '81 I did my father's obituary on the air, and I remember saying, just, you know, it wasn't an obituary; it was just a thank you. And, you know, my dad passed away, and he was 51, and I just thanked people for giving me a call and sending me a card, and I think in the end I said something like, you know, we'll really miss him. And then Ray took over, and he really couldn't take over. He says, "How?"
I don't know how I got into doing obituaries, but I did obituaries, especially if they
You
were
did?
community people that were well known.
We had a
you know.
sponsor. I think it was a
That was
sponsor.
before.
Oh,
before John Masciarelli used to sponsor the obits. But before that, I would cut them out and do them. And people said, "What the hell is he doing?" Obituaries.
Maybe that's why local radio
People
died.
all around us. I missed that. I'm sorry.
I think
That's why
Ray.
radio died. Local radio. That's why local radio died.
It's inevitable too that whenever Ray does his birthday list, you know that some people are gone.
That,
It happens all the time.
So I changed the way I do the birthday. Says I don't know if they're alive or dead, so I say it's the birthday of. Birthday of so and so. They may be dead, but doesn't mean that you can't remember the memory. So thanks to Obashan Hardware, I do it for 1 minute at 20 after 5 in the afternoon. It's pre-recorded. It's not like the old days where we could do a little bio on someone. And the thing about it is, if you do it enough, and it's pretty regular, it begins to resonate with people. Because every one of those has an extended family and they have friends.
Yeah.
And so that begins to filter down. And if you do it long enough, and I did it for 15, 20 years.
People are dying to be on the air with Ray.
That's right. And then so much so that John Masciarelli actually sponsored the obits eventually. But
You know, when I was doing the news, and basically that's what I did all the time, there were people who some people were very offended because their names were on the news. And my uncle was a captain on the police department. And he used to say to me, if somebody doesn't want to get in the news, they shouldn't be doing something to get in the news. And a very comedy story was, I went in the police station one morning, and this happened back in the 60s. This man was working for the city, and he was driving the sweeper on Wallace Road in Fitchburg. And this gentleman was out for the evening, and he met this young lass, and of course he was married, and on the way up Wallace Road, he smashed into the sweeper. And the young lady, who was not his spouse, was injured, and he was arrested for driving under the influence. And I had it on the news, and the gentleman's wife called me. And she says, I don't know what you're putting it on the air about my husband for. I mean, you know, he was with somebody that wasn't his wife. I'm his wife, and, you know, you've got to fix that. And I said, well, let me see. Being the smart ass that I am, I said, guess what? I'll put the sweeper driver in the front seat with your husband, and I'll have the woman driving the sweeper. Is that...
I just want to thank everybody for all your public service, and I had the pleasure of being on WEM for 6 years, so I'd like to thank Mr. Philippone, Dave Clark, Ray C. for all the encouragement. And does anybody remember Jack Richards?
I do.
Thank you.
Sure.
He was a neighbor of mine in Lunenburg.
He brought rock and roll into Fitchburg.
He did. He brought parties in Fabian or whoever in Fitchburg.
Jack lived on White Street.
Yes, he did. White's just next door neighbor. Just because the names, the local names, I won't mention the big-time national names, but that's why I wanted to get into radio, because of Ray C. and Jack Raymond, Jack Richards.
I'm glad you brought it up, because as a 14-year-old, I'd listen to him at night. Sure. He was on at night.
That's right.
And he was playing, there was sort of called chicken rock. During the day, it would be middle of the road, and at night, Jack would play what we were buying, you know. And if you're 14 years old and you're a little bit isolated, you're not as fragmented today. You can get the product anytime. But then, in 57, radio was your only way of listening to the music, which is the way it was in England, too. This is how they got to know American pop music. And we got to know from radio, and Jack would promote clubs. Remember the Edsels and things like that? He put on a show at the Fitchburg Theater once, and he had the clubs come in. We were the Cleghorn Wheelburners. And he had contests going and things like that, but there was a real... And he had us on the air. We actually visited, you know, you're 14 or 15 years old, you're going on the air. There was another guy who worked there ever so briefly. I think it was called, his name was Chaz Grenier, Charlie Grenier. Big Charlie. Big Charlie. You remember Charlie Grenier? And he had a Saturday morning high school show for kids. And I don't know how I ended up there, but I did a half hour there as well. Yeah. But if you had an interest, in those days, it was fun. You had a couple of big turntables there, and these were monster things that sat on the floor, and the turntables were this wide because they held 16-inch discs. And you could cue your record up, and the whole working of a studio, running spots, putting there are cartridges there. This is the way we used to tape them. You'll see them on the display table. And so that whole way of broadcasting, you did it all yourself. That's what was fat. Today, it's on a computer screen. And there are advantages to that, but it's not like the old days where you cued your music. A lot of times, if it was loose, you played what you liked. Other times, there were music directors, because after payola, they took a lot of that control away from the air personality. And payola arrived in 1960, and it was a scandal. Congress could take the money, but radio personalities couldn't. Right. That's the way it was, and it still is today. They made regulations for us, but not for them. And so it was. This is what I think fascinated me about it, not knowing that it came with a lot of territory: sales, engineering, promotions, management. So there was a lot you could do in the brand, and also, for me, it was playing the music and having a great time and saying things, but not knowing that it took a lot more than that. And so you grow into it. And the younger you are, the better off it is, because you can make your mistakes early and then move on.
Quick Jack
Jack
Richard
Richard.
story was the very first time I was on the air. I was a Cub Scout. And we took a tour of WEIM, which was on the second floor on Main Street above Murnix. And so I was, I think, 10, because it had to be about 1957. So we went into the studio, and he actually interviewed us on the air. And the question he asked was, are you a Elvis fan or a Pat Boone fan? And I said, Pat Boone, and this has been bugging me ever since. Pat Boone. If it was Debbie Boone, I would have, yeah.
Earlier, Ray talked about the anonymity of radio, and sometimes that gets you into trouble because people don't know who's talking if there are multiple announcers on a broadcast. And this is a story about Tom Connery, which I'm sure Tom won't remember. I think Dave will once I get into it. Dave and I did a lot of high school broadcast sports together, including basketball. This was back in the 70s when Fitchburg and Notre Dame had tremendous basketball teams, and over the course of several years, the Marty Caron, Jimmy Campbell, Angelini of Notre Dame, and DeSuzio, Spagnola, a couple of players in Fitchburg High, and they were tremendous basketball teams. And when they met head-to-head, tremendous games. So much so that they moved them from the old Notre Dame gym. When Notre Dame was the home team, they'd either go to Monty Tech or Leominster High School to play the game because they would fill the gym. Well, Dave and I had done one of those games, and we usually did a couple of games a week. It was usually a Tuesday, Friday night thing. Tuesday night we did Fitchburg, Notre Dame. Friday night, Dave couldn't make the broadcast for some reason, and Tom Connery was asked to fill in. So Tom and I did a broadcast from Leominster High School, and you had to sit in the stands at Leominster High School. It was a terrible place to do a basketball play-by-play and cover a game, but nonetheless, we were sitting in the stands. Tom was doing the play-by-play. We got to halftime, and again, back in those days, you didn't go back to the studio for anything. You had all live copy. You read all your own commercials. Nothing was played back at the studio. You kept the broadcast from the beginning to the end. So you had to fill at halftime. Sometimes you'd have an interview, but most of the time you just talk amongst yourselves. And Tom got into a rant about the Fitchburg Notre Dame game. And he was critical of, I think Fitchburg had lost, and he was somewhat critical of the Fitchburg loss. We went on, finished the broadcast. The watering hole back in those days was the Peter Pan on John Fitch Highway. So the radio guys and teachers and coaches would all end up at the Peter Pan after the games. And Doug Crutchfield was the coach of Fitchburg High. Well, Fitchburg was on the road that night. They were playing St. John's. I got to the watering hole earlier than the Fitchburg crowd. And I remember standing at the bar, and in comes Doug Crutchfield, and we were very good friends. They had a very good rapport with Doug. But Doug had a pretty good trigger temper when he got going. Somebody had told Doug what had gone on the WFGL broadcast that night, but attributed the comments to me. So Doug came into the Peter Pan, and I happened to be standing at the bar for some reason. I went to say hello to him, and and the place was packed, and he just exploded in front of all these. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I couldn't, for the life of me, think what I had said. And then I came to realize, as he went on, what he was talking about. I had to appeal to Dave to intervene to make peace with Doug, because for quite a while he really believed that whatever Tom said. Tom, what did you say?
I remember.
Got me into trouble.
I remember that.
See, if that was TV, that wouldn't have happened.
And all I said was, Fitchburg was out-coaced tonight.
No.
And that set him into orbit.
Oh.
We have to wrap it up.
So thank you, Dave.
Folks. On that note, we need to wrap it up, but thank you all for coming. Please feel free to stay and talk with our our radio greats.
Oh, you didn't tell me about that.
And enjoy some refreshments. And don't forget the...
Let's all go to the Peter Pan. That was great.
Yeah, good night. When we went on strike.